is the value in 1 year's time, discounted. In 2 years' time, discounted. 3 years, 4 years, and so on, and so on. So that's the principle of this notion of present value. And what we can do, I think what I've done here, is just change the notation slightly to indicate exactly what it is we're focusing on. So, typical bit of shorthand there for cash flow. You could argue free cash flow. So it might be FCF, and you might see that in things that you've read as well. And more succinctly, and again, probably the way you will see it in various kind of readings that you come across, we can use a summation sign to actually say that we're adding all of those together. What we can also do is use a couple of subscripts here, so a subscript and a superscript, to indicate exactly what we're doing. Not the best way to present this, but I'm not that great with PowerPoint. My children tell me there are better ways, but I haven't managed to work it out. Okay? But just to indicate exactly what we're talking about there. The first thing that we're doing for each time period is taking our cash flow and dividing by the appropriate interest figure. So we're doing that, we can see from above, there, and so on. After we've done that, we're adding them together. So the summation, this notion of adding together, comes after we've done the calculation that I've deliberately put in the square brackets there. And as I say, the other parts, the superscript and the subscript, are just indicating the time periods. So present value now is 0. Looking into the future, the first future value is 1. So the first figure will be t equals 1 in our equation. Then we'd have t equals 2. Then we'd have t equals 3, as it indicates above. Then 4, 5, 6. And at some point, we'd probably say, that's enough. Because eventually, that figure we calculated would be so small, it would become insignificant. The alternative argument, at least theoretically, would be continually into the future. But eventually, those figures would be so small that it wouldn't actually make much difference. So there we have our first notion of how to determine the value of the firm, and hence in principle, how to determine, sorry, I'll leave that one on to the next one. Oh, it's gone, this is, it's that one. Right, okay, can you see that? Yep, good. In principle, how to determine the value or the price of a share. We've got the value of the company, we simply divide by the number of shares, and we have a potential valuation model here. Another possible valuation model is something, as you can see here, that is quite often referred to as the dividend valuation model. And in a moment, I'll click again and hopefully show you what that is. I forgot to say at the beginning, feel free to stop me and ask questions. All right, I don't want to just stand at the front for however long it takes, and there we go, and talk. Okay.
You didn't put your assumptions in there, which is that interest rates will be greater than inflation, and that interest rates will not change.
Yep, and?
What happens if, for example, interest rate is less than inflation? What's going to happen then?
Right, okay. Well, we can go further, though I wasn't going to today, and we can say, well, is it a nominal interest rate? Okay, which is what I was implying in the model there. Or is it a real interest rate? Which I guess would be our nominal interest rate minus, that's what I normally use, minus the inflation rate. Okay? So that's what we could argue, that it should be the real interest rate, not the nominal. My assumption, if you want me to state it, would be maybe at the moment, or in my example, there's no inflation. So they turn out to be the same. But the other thing to think about is that, as you suggested, we are talking about into the future. And we do not know the future with certainty. So this is a principle, or sorry, the previous one was a principle. This also is a principle when we look at it in a moment. It's not saying that somehow you could do this calculation and say that's the share price. If it was only that easy, then we will be out there doing it and saying, well, that's a bit low, buy those. That's a bit high, sell those, whatever, or the other way around. But it's not that easy. You know? Any other questions? Okay, so a second model, again, you'll see in lots of textbooks, referred to as a dividend valuation model. And to try and get a handle on how this one works, think about the following scenario. What you do is you buy a share now and you hold it for a year. At the end of the year, you sell it. And what we want to know is that present value idea again. So what is the value now of the share that you sell in a year's time? So let's use P0 to represent the present value of our share. That present value is going to be determined by two elements. Firstly, the dividend that you receive during the year that you own the share. So the company pays out, or I guess you hope the company pays out some dividend. And that's part of what's going to figure in the valuation. But then you're holding the share for a year. At the end of that year, you sell it. So the other thing that's going to give it value is the price at which you manage to sell the share in a year's time, so P1. What we're trying to get a handle on is what is the value now? Hence, we're discounting again. So there, again, is our interest rate, and again, we're dividing by our interest rate. Now think of someone else who purchases that share in a year's time at that price P1 and also holds it for a subsequent year. Again, the value to them would depend on the same factors as it did to you. So now we're talking about the value to that individual in a year's time of something that accrues in 2 years' time. So it's going to be the dividend from when you buy it to when you sell it. So the dividend in 2 years' time. And it's also going to be the price at which you manage to sell it at the end of the second year. Because again, we're looking into the future, we're discounting. So 2 years hence, and 2 years hence. And then we can think about the same principle again. So we can think about the purchase in year 2, the purchase in year 3, the purchase in year 4, and so on. So we can think as many time periods forward as we want to. And if we do that, We then have a dividend figure in here. We have a dividend figure in here. We have a dividend figure in here. So eventually, if we think about a number of time periods forward, so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on, eventually what we have in terms of determination of our share price is just a whole set of dividends. And again, discounted continually into the future. And again, we can use a bit of shorthand to indicate the principle behind that. So again, we've got our summation notion. So the summation of our discounted dividend figures. And that's the basis of this notion of our dividend valuation model. So the notion would be, dividend 1 period ahead, 2 periods ahead, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And you do see quite often, in terms of like textbooks, maybe articles occasionally, this notion, let's use the dividend valuation model. But there is also related literature, not the focus of my session today, but there is also related literature that says dividends don't have any impact on the value of the firm. And at one level, that might seem a contradiction, given that then other people are saying, or other authors are saying, let's use the dividend valuation model. That notion of no impact is sometimes referred to, as you can see, as the dividend irrelevance proposition. And it's an argument which you might have read about, which is essentially saying dividend policy doesn't matter. Doesn't matter in terms of the value of the firm. So it doesn't matter whether the firm pays out all of its retained earnings in dividend. Doesn't matter if it doesn't pay any out in dividend. Has no impact on the value of the firm. And if you read those arguments or that literature, some of it sounds quite kind of plausible in terms of the arguments that are made there. But I think it's fairly straightforward to take that basic model, think about what we're doing slightly differently, and still get at least a principle for valuing our shares. So rather than explicitly thinking about dividend, given that there is theory, whatever, that says dividends may be irrelevant, what we can think about is earnings per share. As I've said already, those earnings could go in dividend. That's explicit in the model that we've got here. Or it could go in retained earnings. And the argument is if it goes in retained earnings, then that ought to have an impact on the share price in the future, because the company's reinvested it into the organisation, and that should be beneficial to the company in question. So we can produce a rationale for saying maybe slight modifications to this idea, and we still have something that we can use as a principle to determine our share price. Now, the other thing that we can illustrate in terms of our dividend valuation model there is something which I explicitly used in the title of today's talk, and that's this notion of returns. So usually when you look at the literature in this area, people don't talk about the share price or the stock price. What they tend to talk about are returns. And we can see very simply from what we've looked at already what we mean by this notion of return. So as you can see there, the notion of return is simply what we receive in 1 year's time compared to what we pay out now. So the price plus the dividend in 1 year's time minus the price now. Now what I've done is label that actual return because that would give you $1